How many more years will the language of left and right remain relevant to use is an interesting question. Sort of been there in the conversation for some time. Hey, these don't seem to be fixed in their meaning, so the meanings of them change, but people treat them as though they're fixed. So there's quite a lot of amnesia that goes on in relation, but maybe they're still helpful in some sense. I'm curious for your thoughts on this, Cadell. I'm not sure if Simon or Valeria, you're aware, but Cadell, you've been teaching, and it might be coming close to the close now, of course, on Hegel's
Yeah,
philosophy of right.
I just taught the last lecture 2 nights ago, but this issue does come up of the left and the right, because I think that we have to situate the left and the right historically as a very modern phenomenon of state politics, of nation state politics. I mean, the origin of the left and the right was a spatial metaphor, right, for representative democracy, or well, first constitutional monarchy and then constitutional democracies. And of course, you didn't need left and right when there were just absolute monarchies. There's no point for that metaphor to function. But the thing that I'm thinking about more and more, I've proposed it a few times, is that the left and right metaphor might be breaking because it doesn't include time within itself, meaning it's a spatial metaphor, not a temporal metaphor. So that left and right makes sense for the modern nation state organization. But if the modern nation state organization is itself reaching its own limits to deal with global phenomena, then it could be that we get trapped in these extreme polarizations and um, sort of what Valeria was saying about these very small differences that from the outside look identical, but internal to this party system create an impossible friction, because whatever the nation state is right now, it's unable to fundamentally deal with, I think, global flows of capital and even social global flows of human beings. I mean, most of the issues, I think, come down to the nation state as an agent is kind of becoming a sunk agency in regards to its capacity to actually represent people. And neither the left or the right wing can do really anything about it. So I think as a consequence of not being able to confront what seems to me to be a fundamental impotence in the political form itself, perhaps polarizations appear, perhaps historical memory or repetitions from 20th century forms are all we have left. You know, fascism, communism, these are 20th century forms. These were real to the 20th century. I'm not sure how well they map onto the tensions and antagonisms and struggles that are really going on in the 21st century. So long story short, what I'm just saying is that it could be that we live in such a different world in the 21st century that our political categories from the modern world are breaking, and the forms, like the very, like, so let me just one more example. So I don't know if you guys have read Thomas Piketty's book Capitalism in 21st Century, but it's a big tomb famous book, was released a decade, or 2014, I think. But in that book, you know, he does this very thorough analysis of not only income inequality, but wealth inequality
Mhm.
on a global level. And then he proposes what would be the ideal solution to this situation, and proposes things like a global wealth tax, for example. And he's drawing there on the history of the 20th century in regards to the emergence of state welfare systems to redistribute money in social democratic policies. But what he's missing is that there's no way to get there. Like there's no way for nation states to coordinate for a global wealth tax. It's not a possible solution. It's an idealistic solution, but it's not. There's no coordination possibility for that to be implemented. So there's a problem of the form of government, and I don't, and then of course there's all this psychotic, semi-psychotic discourse. Of course, nobody really wants a global state. The idea of a global state is maybe impossible, but as a consequence of us not being able to deal with global issues, you know, the nation state reaches its limit and insanity seems to be ensuing, and that's where. But I've kind of, and I'll stop now, but I'll just say, like, I think as a consequence of this around 2016, I kind of pulled away from national politics in terms of paying attention to it because, it just kind of drove me a bit insane. And I guess I was trying to get clear on where my actual agency was politically. And I didn't see it in engaging national politics.
Mhm. There's a lot of, as you were talking about that, how it's spatial and not temporal, and how things are locked in sort of how nation states and ways of governance seem to be locked in the 20th century. The image I'm getting is I often think in ecological terms, and the image I'm getting is that the organizing system currently, the global organizing system is the one of, well, we can call it capitalism, but it's a swarm intelligence that is metabolizing and digesting all flows of capital. And it is ascribing those rules to everything and, well, yeah, turning it into capital. But you can see this as a like a super efficient, or maybe not efficient, that's not the right word, but a super ferocious amoeba or a swarm intelligence that is metabolizing indeed, so turning one resource into something else. And we can picture the nation states as being one holon smaller, like smaller organisms within that larger field that are eating parts of the metabolites that are being generated by this larger, all planetary encompassing intelligence. But the nation states are old organisms, so they haven't been keeping pace with the evolution of this larger field. While what I'm picturing is that the corporations, so multinational corporations, or like these large like things like BlackRock, or like anything that's most likely, we can point to anything that's really good at acquiring capital within these rules. That is a successful organism within the field that's generated by this swarm intelligence. So this thing that we are running both on our own biological hardware, so our neurological systems and how we interact with each other in our actions, but also more and more on silicon-based entities on the internet, and most likely artificial intelligence. And so as long as the ecosystem, the ecosystem is determined by this swarm intelligence that's running this certain program that is under the rules of what we might call capitalism, or, well, it's probably something else already. We will only see, I think, organisms flourish, which will also be sort of swarm intelligence like organisms, which companies are as well, like nation states. And we'll only see those type of programs run. And then I'm thinking also about ideologies, like the ideological ways of doing governance and gaining popularity amongst people is very that also seems like an attractor state. It almost seems like so if you believe one thing, or let's say you ask a person what they believe in and you hear 3 main political opinions, then probably you can fill in the rest. So it's like a attractor state complex that draws people into a certain body, a certain amoeba body, let's say, and that is feeding on the flows of capital, and it's competing with other swarm intelligences. And we're in the midst of that. And then I feel very much like what Cadell said, like I also stepped back from the normal, let's say, political sphere, or becoming less and less. I watch it, I think, I observe it from a distance, but I feel in no sense any calling or any strong urge to be active within those structures or to put a lot of effort in it, because I feel like, yeah, this is the things are happening on a larger scale or on a way more complex scale. And with the lack of global governance, yeah, we wouldn't want a global government, because then it's just that system most likely more solidified. So now we still have the advantage of it being chaotic, and there's a lot of disadvantages from that as well. Global climate collapse and biodiversity loss and all these things, all these problems. So I think what I'm often feeling into or looking for, or maybe longing for, is a global organizing swarm intelligence, which is life affirming. And I would say that's Gaia theory, these kind of things. But that will have to include, so it cannot be an archaic Gaia like we picture it, the hunter-gatherer believing it. It has to be Gaia theory that integrates integrates modernity as well. This is what I'm aiming towards, or at least this is where I put my efforts. Yeah.
Let me pick up on your metaphors and add a few pieces. So I want to contrast their bacteria and bacterial colonies with organisms. Because they're both a bunch of cells together, but one is like a bunch of the same, and one is like a bunch of differentiated things that are integrated into a bigger whole. Both our cells and our psychology, what you talked about swarm intelligence, both at the cellular level, at the psychological level, I am also a bunch of motivations that are paying attention to different things and are coordinated to make what feels like me. And societies and cultures are like another level up of that, right? It's a bunch of, you can have a bunch of people who are more or less the same, or everybody is aiming at being this ideal person that will function in isolation and coordinate with the other bacteria, with the other people. Or you can have something that is differentiated and integrated, like with different people with different motivations, with different, paying attention to different things, coordinating to form an organism. And of course, you can have groups of people who pay attention to different things and coordinate with another group of people that pay attention to another different thing. And if this politics were working in a good way, you would have one group paying attention to one thing and the other group paying attention to it. They would be coordinating to form the bigger organism of the state. And hopefully we could find states that have their cultures, have their way of doing things, but can coordinate with each other to form the bigger body of the earth, of Gaia, of everything. So that's one thing that is in my mind right now. And the second is one other thing that John mentions, that politics is downstream from culture. So the way we do politics is very much related to how we see the world, how we see ourselves, how we see people working together, how we see cooperation. And it's like those things are But there's also this niche construction thing happening there, that culture forms people and people form the culture, and there's this ongoing thing there. That I think all those pieces are relevant to the conversation, so I wanted to add them on the table.
Go ahead, Cadell.
On this idea that politics is downstream from culture, one of the ideas I want to share is the structure that Hegel's thinking in the philosophy of right is that the ethical system is like a fractal between family, community, and state. And he's trying to identify dialectical links between family and community and state. And it could be that what I'm sensing in the digital, at least sphere, but I think it's symptomatic of probably what's going on in the larger culture, is that there's a little bit of a Christian revival going on. And this Christian revival, I think, could be in relationship to this idea that politics is downstream of culture, that if we deal with the cultural issue, that there could be ripple effects towards the political. And my concern here is just that the Christian revival dimension is something that seems to me particularly well suited and particularly, I guess, adapted to the link between family and community, but not particularly well adapted to the issue of community and state. And that's where we get obviously issues, traditionally speaking, of the relationship between theocracy and modern politics. So we're back at the left-right thing, right? So, and then when I was analyzing sort of my understanding of what Hegel was trying to get at with the philosophy of right, it seemed to me like the family community link was still, I could still see the dialectical connection, but when he's analyzing the relationship between community and state, I could no longer see the dialectical connection because our situation is so different, and it seems like that link has been completely shattered. And so I think the question, at least that I'm wrestling with right now, especially in this context, of politics is downstream from culture, is that if there is a Christian zeitgeist that continues to take hold in the West, and I think this is our probable situation, and I think it's probably good, that this could open up a new spirit of family and a new spirit of community. But then we're still left, I think, confronting the ultimate issue of what to do with global capital and how to build communities that have real governmental support and have real state agency that is actually representing people as opposed to representing capital. And it's not so clear how that link is connected, but it could be that if this sort of Christian spirit continues, of course, Holy Spirit, it could be that if Christian spirit continues to work its way through the West, that new possibilities open up in the link between community and state. And the only idea I've heard so far, because I've been reading a lot about this, the only idea I've heard so far that seems to me like a possible avenue or opening is, what if the oligarchic class turns on itself? Like, that's the only possibility. That seems to me the most possible, is like, because there's not that many, right? Like, it's not a big class. It's small numbers of people, and they're all internally networked, or many are internally networked. They all at least know about each other. it would only take a few of them to turn on their own class to open up conversations about what a different type of, in Simon's language, global swarm intelligence or life-affirming Gaia theory that includes within itself the modern world. It can't just be this ecological Gaia theory or, naturalistic Gaia theory. It has to be a Gaia theory that is thinking about global intelligence in terms of political economy and thinking about capital itself as an organism. States and capital are organisms in a certain way. That maybe that metaphor doesn't totally hold, but it is at least a metaphor that we could work with.
I want to just quickly point out that this idea of the fractal between family and state and etc., it's much older than Hegel. Like Confucius was on it already even before Jesus when he said it. When the heart mind is regulated, the family will be regulated. When the family is regulated or in order and functioning properly as an organism. I even have the Chinese character. Yeah, I think that's the one. Not sure, but it might be. So yeah, the family is regulated, the state will be regulated. When the state is regulated, the whole world will be at peace. So they were already on it much before Christ even. So it's not, that idea is not necessarily related to the Christians. It's also interesting because their view on that is independent of higher authorities like God. They have the Tao and everything, but that's a different story. But yeah, it's an old idea, very old.
I just want to just quickly say to that, of course, what I was trying to say there, I'm not trying to say that Hegel is unique in articulating that particular structure. But what I would say is that when we take that structure and we think about it historically, I don't think we can anymore say that if family, community, and state are all sort of well regulated, that the world will be at peace anymore. Because I think that there is a force above the state now. So and I don't know, and this is my question. Like, I'm skeptical also of Hegel's philosophy, but I'm also super skeptical of ancient world philosophies in general, because they could not have been aware of global capital, because global capital didn't exist in their time. So it could be that, and also we don't want to go back to an ancient world system where, the state is seen as this higher authority, which is really a pseudo unity because it's not really making room for individuality in the way that the modern world demands space for individuality. All of the modern world rights revolutions didn't really have analogs in the ancient world. So I'm just trying to say here that whatever ancient world or whatever thinkers in the past thought about the way to get towards a higher state regulation, I think the situation we're facing globally now presents us with a real conundrum, because it's not clear that the global forces can be regulated. That's my idea. I don't think the global forces can be regulated in the way that ancient peoples thought they could, or maybe they could, but maybe there's a huge scale issue that's opened up.
Yeah, I feel like there's I think it could be really valuable to inquire into the meaning of regulation at multiple levels of conception. At the level of politics, people think about policy and, in that sense, tweaking things about how people can exchange and putting up barriers here and impediments there and cutting regulations there, this type of thing. At the individual level of the body, we think about the nervous system in the context of relationship, whether in family or community. We think about co-regulation in a psychodynamic sense, in a really embodied sense. And what this, and something else I'd also invite into the mix of contemplation is also an opening of the meaning of authority. Authority in the sense of I have causative power over you, just or unjust, but also authority in the sense of authorship. And in that regard, let's say a kind of appropriate proximity. In some sense, I really do like I mean, there's a relationship between these two notions of authority, but I do like the indigenous notion of the lookout in that, which is sort of denoting that, whether area of land or context in the social sphere, that it is appropriate for you to take responsibility for. It's your lookout. You're on watch, custodian for that in some sense. And what this brings in is considerations of justice and maturity and participation in the kind of processes of social valuation that afford a sufficient perception of, let's say, clarity and respect, and like appropriate hierarchy, I guess, in that sense, of meaning and capacity to orient relationship, something like that. And the reason I'm bringing some of this stuff in is, on the one hand, it can feel quite separate to relate with that to the notion of sort of what it is to relate with big capital in the context of massive scale. And hence, speaking about regulation at these multiple levels, I'm quite interested in the dialogical challenge of relating with such different levels of complexity. And I'm curious about, to add one, maybe two other pieces in. One, what's very present at the moment in a number of these conversational contexts is the esoteric, exoteric pairing in relation to some of this, which is to say that there are some modes of, let's say apprehension, understanding, which are challenging to convey and require right context, that can require sort of right context and educational pathways to support the participation in, for instance, understanding some of these things we're speaking about, but also to participate in the regulative act itself in culture space, which is to say, and to add the final thing in, I do think, and something like art and beauty and has a really important role to play here, touching back on this notion of sort of authorship, and then what would be sort of distributed participation in the kind of authorship that can render at least perceivable and in some sense legible to itself the congregation or the whole making of value that might serve in a dynamic moment as a kind of insufficient but sufficient in that moment orientation for unity. And the final piece, which is, you know, proper freeform style here, really, is that, and I can't speak to this, but I'd be very interested in like a comparative, a sort of a dialogue around the differences between, let's say, the kind of the lodestone center of gravity sort of telic orientation of Christianity and how it differs from notions of Daoism with respect to how much genuine whole-making, or we might say in a Hegelian sense, how much is the social structure and it's say the spirit of Christianity capable of more consciously accepting its participation in sublation, which is to say, how much can it let go appropriately, you know, in one sense. Whereas with the notion of Taoism, of course, distinct from Confucianism, which is interesting that, you know, you're mentioning Confucianism with the community state family thing and mapping on. I'd be very curious about whether or not people think Christianity is more Confucianist or Taoist. But there is this notion in the context of Taoism that, you know, there's an inexhaustibility to the the ongoing presentation and becoming of creativity. And it's been my sort of sense that there must be like a vitality of exoteric through esoteric participation in the whole making of art as such to enable the possibility of a sufficient, although inadequate, dynamic unity of appreciation in order for there to be something like, you know, a not violently collapsing social intelligent organism with respect to whole planetary function, something like that. So this is a lot of what's sort of coming up for me and trying to relate to some of these notions.
I'm just going to jump quickly, if that's all right. This is great. I've jumped into the deep end. Hello, by the way, everybody. I'm just going to say that. I like where you went there at the end there, Tim, with what the different metaphysical precepts are between the East and the West. That might be worth comparing with respect to how they would afford different forms of participatory knowing. I'm really interested in that, and especially the phenomenological thresholds that are always in flux when it comes to where the boundaries of our sense of self is in that kind of like exo connect. I think Lehman was talking about mesoteric, and I'm assuming that that's whatever that liminal layer is between the eso and the exo. But, you know, just interested in that point, because that seems to be, well, in all honesty, that's just one interesting point that I'm interested in here. But yeah. Anyhow, go on, Simon.
Yeah, very good point, Jern. Again, I want to pull it to the sort of biological metaphor. It's how are these different frameworks, these different metaphysical frameworks, how good or how adept are they as a recontextualizing field? So I'm seeing like if you have the single-celled organism, if it only sees itself in its own context, that usually leads to cancer. If the cell sees itself within the context of an organ, then it can operate within that organ and it can diversify and it gets its right position, or it gets to do sort of its context often determines what type of cell it becomes. That's in cell biology and diversification. That's necessary. So where in the field is it? And is it aware that it's within there in the field? So cancer cells sort of disrupt or decontextualize themselves so they can operate on a completely different metaphor or on a completely different program. And so what I'm thinking now is if we have the whole body, let's say, of the human species, that is a level of organization. But then we have what we were talking about, this capital as this sort of force. And here I think the esoteric view and what Tim was also talking about, so the level of, not the level of education, but are people, can we find the right means of becoming aware that we are living in multiple contexts at the same time? And can we become powerfully oriented towards this larger organizing principle, so this larger context, in which once we become aware of that, we cannot help but act from a place of care. And then I think it's super interesting to orient or to think about what are these different, indeed, like the East-West differences, but also what is the allure of capital? What is the allure of this force and how it's calling to recontextualize oneself as an, let's say, as an oligarch or as a master of the universe, or what is this calling? What kind of body are we called into when we are called into this metaphysical shape of this mammon or this moloch, or what is that? And how can one individual orient itself towards a different body? And that can be Christ, but it can also be Gaia, that can be the cosmos. And and then it's indeed what is in between. So what mediates this recontextualization? What are the receptors that we need on the surface of our cells to be able to detect that we are part of this larger thing? What type of receptors fit with what type of impulse and what type of message? How do we attune to these kind of things? What practices or what way of being is that? So that, yeah, that's coming through for me. But then already we need to have it's so difficult for, if I talk about these things for myself already, and it's so difficult growing up with the cultural heritage of being a sort of disconnected individual. So the conditioning is already, I think, biasing us towards orienting us towards this other field, this more, I would say, cancerous field. So where do we find this? Maybe it's in the Christian tradition, maybe it's in different Eastern traditions, maybe it's in animism, maybe. So where can we find that sense for a new way of orienting us towards this global consciousness, which incorporates this need for governance on an economical, familial, supranational level, because that was never needed before, indeed. But how in this sort of decontextualizing soup do we find new context?
I could just
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it just sounds like that pulls the scope of the lookout much further out, in the sense of like trying to reconfigure the different fractal relations between various organs within organs type thing going on there. But then organism in itself, but then in excess, becoming too much on the side of authorship, that appropriate authority is not given up to higher order unity. Now I want to focus on that, but yeah, it's seems quite fraught anyhow.
I have an interesting piece on the ancient metaphysics from Professor Chad Hansen from the University of Hong Kong, an American that has lived there for 20 years. And he proposes that at the root of the philosophy concerning normativity in the East and in the West are different metaphors. In the West, we have a metaphor of law. So normativity is like a law. You have something that has some authority and can tell us what to do and what not to do. And if we don't do it, you get punished. At the root of the normativity philosophy in the East, the metaphor is a path, which Tao is a path. So a path does not punish you. It does not, if you go on it just makes things easier. It gives you a direction. And if you go bushwalking, you will get into trouble. And a path emerges as people travel it. It's not that there is something outside of the world giving us the path, but the path emerges through the people traveling it. And as I said, Tao, the translation of Tao is path. And this guy, Chad Hansen, that talks about there being the big Tao, like the big way of the universe, that is the one that cannot be named, and then there are the human DAOs and the social DAOs that are the ways in which we engage in doing things. So I don't know, capitalism is part of a human DAO that we have created. And the path is there and people walk it and it has a normativity to it. That, maybe constructing different paths or making this path better. I think this difference in the metaphysics might... this puzzle piece might help. So that's why I'm putting it there. Or trying to. That's the Tao. It's a very ugly Tao. I also have it on my... It's very ugly because I drew it myself. But
I can jump in here. There's a lot of important things are being said here. I think we're all loosely connected to intellectual circles that are committed to moving from reductionist science to emergentist science or something in that direction. And I think when we think about emergence, I think we need to radicalize the notion of emergence. And what I mean by that is that at one point on this planet, there was just ecology, biology, and in a certain moment, language emerges, culture emerges, technology emerges, and now the consequences of this emergence really is our new environment. Like we can say we go out for a walk and we go out into nature, and I could go later in the park today and enjoy the sun and enjoy the trees and all of that. But really, the environment in which we are forced to interact, it's almost not a choice anymore, is this digital screen. We don't really have a choice whether we engage in capital or engage in internet or engage in technology. It kind of is our new social matrix and medium within which we develop, within which we individuate. And we can find little pockets and spaces where we can get a distance from it, at least at the moment. But it really is the new other for us. And here I just want to situate some of the philosophies that are emerging that really frame this in a radical alien way. Like a philosopher like Nick Land is basically saying techno-capital is an intelligence that's just going to take over from humans. That it's emerged from humans and it's going to continue reproducing itself independent of us. It's going to, that's what I mean by radicalizing emergence. We have to entertain the possibility that emergence means something could emerge from us and actually we become decentered in an even more radical way. Like in the history of science, we've always had these emotional catastrophes when it comes to being decentered, right? When we're decentered from the center of the universe, or where we're decentered from the center of life. But this is even a more radical decentering in a way. You're decentered from the evolutionary process itself, because the evolution process is just going to go on, and you're just like an autocatalytic mechanism in a larger emergent process. And we're on Zoom right now. I think that the term that I keep using is screen being. We're screen beings now. So all of that being said, on this context of like the difference between Christianity and Taoism, or the difference between East and West, what I want to problematize is not problematize. I just want to throw it as an idea, and maybe even especially see if Valeria, if you think this is a valid way of because I'm not an expert on Taoism at all. I'm not an expert on Confucianism. I'm not an expert on Eastern spirituality, philosophies, not at all. But when we think about, for example, on the one hand, the universal Tao, the way of the universe, and then on the other hand, we think about human, society, capital, right? And we think about them as separate. I think that's the mistake, because I think we need to see, actually, no, the human, the society, the capital is the universal Tao too. And so in that sense, I don't know if there's a similar mechanism in the East, but as far as I understand the mechanism in Christianity, is basically the universe becomes subject. God becomes subject. Like God becomes Christ. Like this is the distinction that Christianity to me is introducing. And I don't, like, again, I don't know. There could be many myths all over the world that do similar things. But there's this way in which universe becomes subject. God becomes Jesus. And then we have to see how the absolute is moving through us as human subjects or whatever. And in that context, again, of this, what we're talking about with family, community, and state, and this sort of, and you could even say, like, we could say family, community, and state is something like the way, or the Tao, the path. And we don't need to think about it as an external authority or something like that, but just as a fractal organization that we are participating in. And the problem, again, for me is that if the state is really a sunk agency, if the state is no longer capable of moving with the true flows and pathways of global capital, that is there a link between family, community, and capital? Like, is there? Do we have to somehow form a social order that can, maybe to use Simon's metaphor, create some sort of symbiotic relationship between the cells of the body and the organ of the body? I'm not sure. And again, the only pathway I can see at the moment is could the oligarchic class turn on itself, and what would that look like? What social organizations are possible there? I definitely think in terms of networks, but in terms of the other body that we're giving ourselves to, I'm not sure if traditional religions will ultimately work. I'm also not sure if the secular state will work, but could capital be used to create sustainable digital networks. That's I don't know. That's where my thinking is.
I just want to say quickly, go ahead, Valeria.
One sentence. I just want you to mark that it's interesting that you contrasted the cells and the body. It's like either the cells and the body, and I want to point out that the body is the cells plus the organization. Go ahead, Jurnee.
Would you be able to say more on that again, though? I'd love to know more about how they're coming closer into like the self and the body for you, because this is somewhat in line with a previous thought that I had, but then I want to respond to things that have been said up to this point about maybe the difference between a Gnostic and epistemic approach. With the advent of language, it's moved into an epistemics. And this is where the book religions come in and really radically change things up and accelerate the pace of development at this point through capital. I think I heard you say in a conversation you had, Cadell, that the earliest forms of writing were for conducting taxes. So that speaks for itself as like the origins of language's functional utility towards capital. And I think these speculations do create much vaster distances in needing to have the lookout at the level of us here now, in our individual selves and also digitally networked, having to expand the scope towards the cosmic fractal of the absolute, but not being willing simply to give ourselves over to that transcendent emphasis metaphysically, but still being able to retain some sort of like immanent metaphysical orientation or basis from which to step further out. Seems interesting.
All right, well, I'll try and pick some things up. So it seems like if we go back 10,000, 20,000, a couple 100,000 years, and as Cadell's sort of spoken to at various times in terms of different epochs of evolution, we go from skipping a bunch of the story. Now we're in the time of tribe, and some things happen and we start to scale. People tell different stories about that. The competitive advantage of being able to muster and supply more warriors, more coordinated means of doing violence and maintaining order over different tribes, becoming clans, becoming larger unities. Then it comes along progressively more fixed settlement, tremendous amount of different experimentation in terms of that. Maybe there's fixed settlement for a certain part of the year, and we travel in other parts, we return to certain spots for certain ceremonies, all manner of exploration of different forms of political organizing. It seems that the experimentation of political organization with the primary adaptive landscape being the culture itself, in that sense, the dominance over some constructions over others, in a sense, the dominance of some symbolic orders over others in terms of their capacity for logistical organization and colonization of land. And I think that point with respect to language and, money and law is relevant in terms of the history of that story. And of course, I'm just spinning up a story here really, but the point that I'm saying all of that to make is that we come to a point where we meet the limit and various boundaries of stability associated with the planet itself, with different bioregions themselves. And one of the things that's quite interesting for me, and I think all of us, certainly very present in the zeitgeist, is on the one hand, what it means to reconnect with, let's say, the spirit of indigeneity that was capable of being in a kind of sustainability with a particular landmass, particular context of ecology. And then we have these jumps through, agrarian craft, as Michel Bowens will speak about, and then moving right up to the network dynamics of our present time that Cadell's pointing to, needing to be taken into, ridiculous account when we come to describe the actual habitat in which we're attempting to adapt. And so this relationship between the reconnection with that, sustainable indigenous being, that there seems to be something in that which is a repository of profound quality for conscious experience itself. For instance, I heard the other day, I shared it in the network and on Twitter, an unbelievable Indigenous Australian songman, and his son was singing with him. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. One of the most remarkable musical performances I've ever seen. And the songs and the Indigenous Australians have a very kind of a nonchalant way of saying what they're doing. So he comes along and goes, this is a song about a boat, right? And then he just completely broke my heart, But then there's a song about water. And then there's a song about that his grandfather wrote from 100 years ago, was when the first time he saw a plane. And in each of these songs is a profound transmission. It seemed to me, at least, to be just an outrageous call to remember what matters in some sense. Take water. No matter how, well, we'll see just how adapted to the digital we can become. We have to completely replace our bodies to no longer be reliant on water. Maybe someone could, it seems like farcical to actually suppose that as an addition to the conversation, really. And so this repository of quality, and it seems like whatever it seems like the processes which have generated capital have not primarily come through capacity building in the context, in the context of sustainability, and yet somehow they have to return to support of like reintegrating the notion of sustainability. And that's a very interesting thing. That's become so memed, right? So it's become unbelievably memed. The one other image, rather than go on with this, I feel like that's probably enough. I'm not super landing this, but the other image I want to bring, which was something that came up earlier in the conversation, is something I spoke to Guy Sengstock about, probably publish that in the next couple of days, is my perception of the majority of people engaging with discourse online. I'm going to use Piers Morgan as an example. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of views on conversation about Israel-Palestine. And people aren't tuning in because they're wanting to participate in some, generative process of truth and really receiving. There's sort of tribal senses of what the true and the good is, and that's that. and I notice myself tuning in as well, because, and I think this really counts for the majority, or at least I'd contend that in context of such massive unknown but potential power swings this way or that, it feels quite a lot like paying attention to the herd to see where the herd's moving. It's a kind of a swarm intelligence in terms of mimesis, which produces a certain, intelligent, or at least a certain movement and arc in the context of that social organism as a block, let's say. But it doesn't strike me as it's not participating in a genuine process of authorship. It's not participating in a way that, let's just call it, that would be other to solely mimesis. And it seems like to me, it does, it's, if we talk about capital supporting networks, then bringing in education there is really quite profound. And in the context of the oligarchs, it's a super important piece. Peter Turchin, right, the sort of futurist, I forget what type of, what field he's in exactly, but it's, predicting the future type vibes, right, based on statistics and various things. One of the key things there is the significance of inter-elite conflict. And I think you're right, Cadell, that's a particular point of volatility that opens up potentiality and is a scale of interaction that's a little easier to conceive from the perspective of a more, the participation in process together. And all right, yeah, I'll just stop there rather than just go on.
Just one thing, Tim. I'll just add something short. The competition between the oligarchs, the image I'm getting is that you have multiple plants with their growing front, the growing tip, which is then the oligarch, most likely, who's in the growing tip of capital. And they're striving upwards to gain more and more sun. But the first one that decides to switch, let's say, to not go compete, but to switch to the program of a flower, then you have a massive diversification of difference. And this will incentivize others as well not to have to outgrow that one. So that's the image that I got.
Yeah, that's a beautiful image. I think the verticality is quite interesting. I'm obviously thinking a lot, as you know, about the dynamics of mycelial networks in the context of the underground. And it does seem like I'm curious, I'm gonna have to go well into sort of liminal unclarity to properly take that on. So maybe I'll hold it for the time being, but I like that as an image, Simon.
It also raises the question of whether or not, practically speaking, the subsequent diversification that could come about from a blossoming understanding of different evolutionary pathways to be made that do not over-compete in the ecology to the detriment of diversity, whether or not it seems like there's an implicit hope towards a return in that which is attributed to the blossom. And I definitely think it's there as like an always mystical possibility. But yeah, I guess I'm still wondering what that looks like going forward, given the seemingly obvious irreversibility of capital, in that it has to contend with the consequences of its existence without, I don't know. I think I probably just turned it back to a problem even though I'm like totally with you on the hope of that.
Well, if I could add one piece in, I think one of the reasons why it's interesting to think about the potential for inter-elite conflict or dynamism, let's say, is that there's a scale there that seems graspable with respect to what participation could even feel or look like, and then outsized influence as a result of that, given the levers of power, or at least the prominence of the role of that organ in the greater body. But it also carries along with it like a really, obviously, really profound asymmetry, which is that the accumulation of capital came, I think it's fair to say that that accumulation of capital comes not from a quality of cultivated relational intelligence in the sense one might imagine as a kind of eldership or a maturation of relational intelligence, but through capacity to reduce the relational context well enough so that it can effectively parasitize the broader ecology. Isn't it kind of its nature is to asymmetrically hoard whatever the abstract of nutrient is in this case. And so to interact, let's say, in the kind of relational process, even the modulation of superstructure at the level of, let's say, the elite mind is it's really very, very curious because the stakes are tremendously high. And well, rather than go on, I'll just stop there, kind of introducing that kind of problematic.
I realize that I am participating in the conversation, but we're talking a lot about capital. And I just noticed that I don't know if I fully understand the depths of the concept that definitely Cadell is in touch with, but I imagine so at least some of you are in touch with like a certain depth when you talk about capital that I just scratching the surface and participating on the surface. So I just wanted to both acknowledge my ignorance and acknowledge the difficulty of working with this kind of differentiation. We are not bacteria, right? We have each other. We have each our source of expertise, and then when we try to communicate with each other, there's something that gets lost in the way. Not all that you're transmitting is reaching me in the way that you are transmitting it, just because I don't have the capacity to receive it. So I just want to acknowledge both my ignorance and the difficulty in general.
Let me add one thing to that, and then I'll because I think that's beautifully said, Valeria, and I'll join you in that. I think one of the things that's maybe a bit of an irony in there is that kind of the point I'm making is that those who might claim, let's say, who might possess capital and would say, I really understand capital in that sense, or I understand how capital works in that limited sense. Kind of the claim I'm making is that comes by virtue of a kind of ignorance as to what capital actually is in some sense. Because who can fathom such vast amounts of money? And also, how much are people in tune with the depth psychology and unconscious processes that orient attention and, let's say, the sexual and power dynamics in a room or in a network in the context where there are such asymmetries? The influence of that is so tremendously massive that in an important sense, like I would say we're all kind of ignorant about capital. That's probably different from what Cadell might speak to in terms of, addressing capital in the context of, political economic analysis. So I'm kind of playing with the notion there a little bit, because certainly it's the case that we can be more or less, well integrating that notion in the context of history and its influence and what have you. And I certainly appreciate the humility with respect to that, Valeria.
Cheers. I just wanted to add a little bit on, who can perceive the depths of capital. In my journey from focusing on molecular microbiology and then going into meta-crisis stuff, the one field I cannot make sense of is economics. I tried, but my brain just doesn't. I just cannot make sense of it. So my take on capitalism or on capital is way more of an occult one, I think. And so Nick Land was mentioned. Yeah, this kind of stuff I find interesting. So this tracks somewhere. And I cannot help but mention that bacteria are not, so they might be homogeneous in genomic content, but they diversify and they work also as a swarm organism. So there's heterogeneity within bacteria and they do a lot of different things, even though it does look like they don't. So there's a lot of complexity there. And we are a collection of bacterial cells. So the first eukaryotic organism, so complex cell, is a endosymbiosis of bacterial cells. So we, in that sense, we are bacteria. And let alone that we mention the amount of bacterial cells in our digestive system and all our fluids and on our skin. Those cells on average, outnumber the amount of human cells on our body. So, yeah, what are we? That's just something that came up for me.
Hey, Cadell, I imagine you have a lot to say, which is, I'm going to be very short, basically. I'm just saying, from what you were saying there, Simon, it sounds like, again, these metaphoric traversals across different fractals of consideration, they translate differently depending on our own dispositions, preferences, and we have to figure out how to be all of them, none of them, and only one of them simultaneously. Like one of them in the sense of like, I have my preferences. I want to be privy to all of them. And I also want to recognize on some metaphysical level that I'm none of them. I don't know. But yeah, it's a challenge to look out on that.
I'll just say quickly that I think politics and economics are strange fields in the sense that even the experts don't know what these things are. Like politicians don't know what politics is. Economists often don't know what economics is. And this was super obvious when the 2008 financial collapse occurred. Because you had all these economists at Stanford, Harvard, whatever, the elite Ivy League schools, and they had their economic models. But their economic models were totally broken, right? And so, a lot of the times economy is a bunch of chickens running with their head cut off, like they just don't know what's causing the crisis, because and this is another way to radicalize emergence, because when we radicalize emergence, we have to realize that what's emerging politically, economically is not only do economists, politicians not really understand it, but it could be that what's emerging is not possible for an individual to understand. Right? It literally breaks the limits of our cognition in a certain way. But for the sake of what we can understand, I think it's best to understand capital as a social relation involving money. So, like, for example, what we're doing right now in my models of thinking is, in a way, trying to sublate capital, because Voicecraft is a political economic entity, sort of a membership platform. But at the same time, we're coming together in Voicecraft for something that really doesn't have any direct relation to money. Like, we're not here for money. Like, I'm not here because I'm not here directly because I'm getting paid or something like that. So there's a way in which I think we have to accept that capital is somehow at the moment necessary for mediating social relations, but we can use it to our advantage if we create spaces where the social relations are rising above that in a way. And we shouldn't be reduced to that. That's the problem, is when people feel so overwhelmed by capital that they feel like all of their activity has to be organized around it, to the point where they live their entire life for it. And then when they retire, they don't know what to do with themselves. So we should commit to, I think, okay, practically speaking, we have to accept that there's a certain dimension that needs to be taken into consideration here, but at the same time, we organize above it, beyond it. And then I just want to say, in terms of the history of capital, in terms of trying to understand this, is that I think this is like like we could interpret this as positive in a way, is that capital breaks, and I have had a lot of conversations with my partner Audrey about this, because she has like this view that it's always been capitalism. Like what are you talking about? Like, money's always been a thing. Like, you go back to the beginning, you're still using money. But the key thing, I think, at least where we've gotten in our conversation, is what capital breaks and what's different about modern capital in relationship to like ancient or pre-modern societies is that ancient and pre-modern societies were predominantly organized by social caste, meaning social caste was more important in many ways than money. And also in the feudal system, land was more important than money. So you have, and also there's a, with traditional caste systems and with feudal hierarchies, there's a certain immobility with the traditional caste. Like, you can't move up and down the hierarchies. Like, there's no way to, like, if you're born in a certain caste, you're born in a certain caste. That's the end of it. A feudal hierarchy, if you're a feudal lord or if you're a serf working on the land, that's the end of it. What capital does is it introduces market logic as the dominant logic of society. And in previous civilizations, in previous societies, market logic was always contained. And even merchants who were trading on the market were seen as low social status. So what changed is that market, like this little bubble of activity, which was predominantly the social relation of capital trading on a market, was seen as low social status and contained within a larger religious edifice of caste, of feudal lord. And then it became dominant. And it was the dominant mode of social exchange. And the form of consciousness that was capable of surviving and thriving in this ecosystem became the zeitgeist. So we call it bourgeois consciousness. Even liberal, like liberal ideology is fundamentally connected to this, which is basically like you have freedom to work on the market. So you have freedom to work in market competition. The problem today, and why it's like, I think a huge issue, is that because of capital mobility is global, basically we're in a situation of hyper competition. And this hyper competition has no regulatory buffer of any kind. And so it can be just simply overwhelming. So I think when we're talking about the possibility of oligarchs turning on themselves, I think what we're talking about is, could some turning occur in which the market is once again put in its place, and competition is still capable, like we still have market competition, but just that market competition is buffered instead of in this hyper exaggerated form. And I think that, not sure who said it, but like, I think what's key here is this relationship between endless accumulation of money, like what would happen for the oligarchs to turn is that they like, and I've seen like enough, like this is possible, I think, like for people to see the endless accumulation of money isn't the thing. Like the endless accumulation of money is not really what you're looking for. And what are we looking for? Like, to me, that's the thing. So there's there are very common narratives, popular narratives about we can't have endless growth. We can't have endless accumulation of money. Usually it's framed for ecological limits reasons. Like that will undermine our own planetary resources or will undermine our own ecological sustainability. But I think the human being needs to grow, and I don't want to sound cliche or I don't want to just throw out empty rhetoric. But I mean, I've dedicated my growth to growing knowledge, intelligence, spiritual practice. We need some sort of growth, and I think that growth is concretely, not just some woo-woo whatever thing. Like I think like knowledge, intelligence, spiritual, like I think that is concretely potentially more valuable than the capital accumulation. And so in the same way that the market was at one time some low status thing and a marginal thing, it could be that what we're doing is like we're like a marginal weird thing. But could it grow? And could it be that capital is used to go? I think we have, like, the way I think is we can't just negate it. We have to accept it, but go beyond it in some way. But what would be so there would be like a type of accumulation, like it would be an accumulation, like we would want to be having richer conversations and dialogues and courses and retreats and community events and workshops. And like, to me, I always want to think of new forms to do things because it's just like, I don't know. Well, I don't know why. But I'll stop there. But I hope that contextualize some things.
Can I just say quickly, it seems like it's the market logic has overtaken the commons logic, and that's where the shift back would be. And whatever the hybrid political economies are that are showing up within the market logic, but trying to return non-naively, is they're trying to figure out how to signal their value as educational spaces and as themselves of some form of like some educational process that affords an authority towards bringing the commons back out as an
belonging.
As an emphatic point.
Yeah. So I'm conscious that we're running close to the end of the scheduled time here. A couple of distinctions to throw out: the relation between growth and increase. Tyson Yunkaporta has made that distinction in Sand Talk. It's been mentioned a lot on the podcast, but where growth he thinks of in terms of accumulation, and increase in terms of the increase in the quality of connection, something like that. And so in the context of the commons, then Jurnee's bringing in the context of knowledge, the capacity to contribute, that context of belonging, context of commons, in that sense, beauty as well. That's much closer to the source of value creation. And so
like a recognition of indigeneity, setting aside all the baggage associated with not being authentically indigenous, like all that.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the sense of like the highest wisdom that is a repository being pointed at.
Yes. in mentioning the songman, I was speaking about the timbre and the texture of his voice, the quality of his voice. It's very interesting because his son was probably in his mid-30s and also just a phenomenal voice. But and as phenomenal as he was clearly in the son to elder relation to his father. And there was something about the presentation of that quality of sort of ripening of the voice in that eldership position that was capable of the deep notes of just multi-dimensional reconnection to spirit, to that sense of what truly matters. And in that sense is the master of the ceremony that reopens the possibility for that reattunement in that context of belonging. And there was something about the presentation in that artistic modality of the indigenous sense of eldership that really hit home for me in a beautiful way. And the other point I'll make, which I've said on a couple times now as well, which is that one of the ironies is that as wealthy as the truly wealthy are, they are actually in need of charity that comes from this other source, this other basis. And that's the very interesting flip. If we think of charity as from the rich to the artist or the rich to the poor, but there's something, but that movement, and so you can either seek to kind of co-opt that, i.e. Orient funds or money from people who are not understanding that, but they might be useful in some sense. And maybe they don't have to understand the whole thing. Maybe I'm not saying it has to come from, there's different ways in and to understanding, and participation in that broader whole of understanding. But yeah, it is an interesting thing. I don't think we'll ever be totally clear of, people talk about the great man or great person theory of history, which, in and of itself is quite reductionistic. But the number of times that, the nuclear keys have been in the lock, and the number of times it was the individual choices which made outside differences to the broader context is also very wild in consideration of this. That in some important way, the fabric of belonging itself at times comes to hang by a thread that but one or but a few are responsible for, is a very strange thing to really reckon with, given the nature of belonging as a distributed phenomenon itself. So yeah, anyway, I really appreciate you all. Perhaps we'll pass it over to Simon if you'd like to just share some words in closing.
Some words in closing, and then I want to unorthodoxly share a minute YouTube video, which I think everybody will enjoy, so we can watch that in silence. Yeah, lovely. There was a lot happening in those closing remarks of each one of you, and for me, if we're talking about market logic as being a value, then I'm thinking maybe we are heading for a revival of a pantheon, and that the pantheon will be these these distinct fields of value, which you can see as gods. And then depending on how you relate to those gods, you're making your decisions. So it's a renewal of seeing the human position as one where you can orient towards certain energies, certain powers, and they shape your life in a certain way. And if you only orient, as we are now almost monotheistic, we operate from the market god, yeah, you see what kind of life that gives. And then what will happen if we reintroduce all those different flows, those different means of orientation? Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. Valeria, is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
So thank you. That it's a very stimulating conversation. Been thinking a lot about the relationship between value and power. I think that is the root of interesting. Money is a representation of contribution, and money is a representation of power. How those things mix together. They are not being proxies for each other. So that's one thing I would think about. Again, thank you everybody for the very stimulating conversation. I'm looking forward to next time.
Well, thank you for that. Your microphone came across as though you were something like Darth Vader drowning. Something like
More like a Borg, more like a Borg of the market.
Yeah, but I was able to make out the words. Yeah. All right. Well, let's watch that video then. It's been awesome to share this conversation.
Next time, let me know in the beginning of when I start talking, not after I have talked.
Well, I was coming in there to potentially like interrupt the final bit, but yeah, I was able to just about hear. That's the other thing about digital communication, is that my sense is that far more it can be transmitted and received than the majority of people generally speak about. Of course, in-person communication is rich in dimensions that the digital is not, but there's also a quality of attention and contemplative process, and also, although this is case in point, qualities of voice and of listening that are themselves profound carriers for signal. And you know, it is unique what's possible in this modality. And so anyway, much love everybody.